So, I'm not going to try and define organised crime because I think it almost is beyond definition, but I do want to talk about some of the characteristics that I think remain pretty constant over time and which you will see in manifestations of organised crime both here in Australia and around the globe. And the first one, it's an obvious point, but they are driven by greed and by profits from servicing illicit markets. And I think it's important to understand that organised crime always operates within a marketplace. And a market analysis is an enormously powerful way of actually getting insight into organised crime and the way it works. But essentially, it's about greed and it's about money. That's what it's about. I said earlier that the popular conception of organised crime is that we tend to think of it, hierarchical, pyramid in shape, all the rest of it. But it's actually the networks that are more important to understand. So the nodes, that is the organisational structures, can take many, many forms, and yes, we do need to know about those, but it's actually the networks and the way these nodes connect together that is much more important for us to understand, because they are fluid, they are flexible, they are dynamic, they are opportunistic. And the other point I make about it is they don't follow the normal rules of social convention. And we understand this because we've all seen examples of literally you can have two nodes or two groups literally fighting 1 minute and then cooperating the next. And then a little bit later on they'll be fighting again. And when they fight, they tend to fight pretty seriously. So it's with guns and knives again at 20 paces. But they're capable of overcoming those sort of longer term animosities if it's actually in their mutual interest to do so. Whereas for most of us, if someone shot at us, we tend to take that personally and hold it against them for the rest of our lives. Organised crime doesn't necessarily work in that way. The point's also been made by the Minister, and I'm sure others will make it, and in fact the very nature of the conference is about this. They are multi-jurisdictional, both national and international. So, it's all the cliches about borders not mattering, all the rest of it. Well, it's actually right. And that poses a very, very profound challenge to law enforcement and to governments at all levels as to how you actually deal with that. They commonly use tactics that involve intimidation, violence and corruption. These themselves pose a real threat to law enforcement. Again, the less sophisticated tends to be more around intimidation and violence. The more sophisticated tends to be at the corruption end. And the more sophisticated they are, the more of a threat they'll actually pose to important public institutions, like police organisations, like local government, like bureaucracy, like government itself. Because again, they'll find their way in. And they'll find their way in for the purpose of subverting, for the purpose of getting information, for the purpose of facilitating their pursuit of money through illicit markets. And then the final point I'd make is that many of them are lifelong career criminals. But the reality is, some of them won't have a criminal history because we won't have caught them. But that's what they are. They are whole of life career criminals. It's the way they make a buck. So in targeting organised crime and its illicit markets, it's absolutely essential to understand how they work, to analyse the networks, and to understand the marketplaces within which they operate. So if you use a market analysis, particularly around drugs, you start to understand that if it's operating in the market, trying to understand the nature of the market, but also understand the supply chain, understand the way the product gets to market. So if we're talking about synthetic drugs, where's the raw material coming from? Who's sourcing it? How's it being paid for? Where's it being delivered to? Who then actually undertakes the manufacturing process? Once it's manufactured, what's the distribution network and how does that work? How are the proceeds being dealt with? And who has overall control? And that is very much the way the markets work. And it helps us from a law enforcement point of view then to start asking questions. If we're actually working on some of these organised crime syndicates and we're not seeing the distribution network, we know we're missing part of the intelligence puzzle. And there's more work that we actually need to go and do to understand that. Equally, if we're not seeing where the money's going, so how are the proceeds being distributed and managed, we know we're missing part of the puzzle. And so we need to go and look. Now, I do want to talk about an example in my past working with the AFP that makes a number of points. It's an example of this supply chain, an example of how organised crime can be hidden, And it's an example of one other aspect that I haven't talked about, that in its manifestation, sometimes organised crime is more disorganised than organised. And that in itself poses real challenges for law enforcement. So a number of years ago, whilst with the AFP, we worked on a drug importation of a very, very significant amount of cannabis resin. So we were onto an Australian syndicate, and it turned out that this syndicate, whilst Australians, they were based overseas, and their role was to do yacht-borne importations of narcotics. That's all they did. And they did it here, they did it in Canada, they did it in the United States. And they had been operating very, very, very successfully for about 20 years before we actually got onto them. And the reason they operated so successfully is that was their niche. They weren't responsible for sourcing, they weren't responsible for the production, manufacture, anything else. They weren't responsible for the sales and distribution. They just had the importation business. And they did it by yacht-borne importations. And they were very, very good at what they'd did. They'd been doing it for a long time. They'd moved offshore. They were living overseas. They were actually living in the middle of the Pacific, which was a perfect base for them because essentially they were using this technique to land drugs, mainly in Canada, the United States, but also in Australia, pretty much anywhere. I think also into the UK they did some work as well. So this was their particular niche, and so it took us a long, long time from a law enforcement perspective to get onto them, because you actually got to be pretty lucky to find them. You have to actually get them hands-on, and that's, you know, they only do that for a very brief period of time. The disorganised part of it is enormously frustrating working on this group. Their plan was to sail a yacht to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, rendezvous with a mothership, ship, you know, multiple tonnes of cannabis resin onto the yacht and sail back into far North Australia. We watched them go out 3 or 4 times, out into the middle of the Pacific, sail around and around in circles and come back. And each time we were pretty confident they actually hadn't met the mothership. I think on about the 4th occasion, 3rd or 4th occasion, they did meet the mothership. The drugs were transshipped to the yacht. The yacht came back into shore, and when it landed, we actually managed to grab them. They'd actually driven a truck up there, up to the landing place. We used that truck to transship the narcotics back to Brisbane, but halfway back to Brisbane, the truck broke down. Why did it break down? Because it was a clapped-out, crappy old truck that they'd actually bought. So this is a multi-million-dollar sophisticated drug importation business, and they'd skimped on the truck to get the drugs, and this is tonnes of cannabis resin, back to Brisbane. And it broke down, so we had to get a tabletop truck up there, drag the truck up onto it and cart it back to Brisbane. The reason that they'd been out 3 or 4 times into the middle of the Pacific Ocean to meet the mothership is because the mothership had broken down. So, you know, we only found out this afterwards. We were wondering, what on earth is this group up to? Gee, they're smart. They're really sophisticated. You know, they must know we're onto them because they're playing, you know, cat and mice with us. But it was nothing of the sort. In a way, it was their own incompetence that provided them with a real competitive advantage over law enforcement. Because, of course, we do these very smart, sophisticated operational orders, and we're really clear about what we're going to do, and the crooks never stick to it. And in fact, there was a real risk for us, because if we'd moved too early on this, if we'd actually moved and grabbed them on one of the sort of, you know, aborted runs, we'd have missed it. We'd have come up empty-handed and, of course, then absolutely tipped our hand to these people. So I think that's a really good example of the nature of the organised crime threat that we're actually dealing with. And isn't it interesting? Because one of the contradictions with that sort of Hollywood image of organised crime is that it's slick. It's much smarter than we are. It's well organised. It just works like a well-oiled machine. Well, my experience of a lot of it is it just doesn't. As I said, it's more disorganised than actually organised. But it always poses a problem for us, because you can never rely on the buggers to do what you think they're going to do at any particular point in time, often through incompetence more than anything else. So I think that's starting to flesh out the issue a bit more. Again, what are some of the costs of organised crime? So we know a little bit more about what it is, but what does it actually mean from us? Well, you know, apart from the obvious costs around justice, there are very significant economic and social costs associated with organised crime. And we heard again the Minister talk about some global figures. We know here in Australia, crime costs Australia, you know, over $30 billion per annum. And again, it's very, very difficult to be precise about this, but it's very, very significant, perhaps 5% of our GDP. We know the total costs of homicide in Australia is $930 million per annum and carries the highest cost per victim, which is around $1.6 million per victim. And again, you know, with the organised crime deaths or murders that we had here in Victoria, that's a very significant cost. Illicit drug dependency in Victoria is conservatively estimated to cost around about $845 million per annum. So, you know, there are real economic costs here. But I guess the point most of all of us in law enforcement never want to lose is that there is also very direct personal individual costs, because drugs operate within a marketplace. At the end, at that marketplace, there is a user. It's called a drug addict. And, you know, they provide the marketplace, they actually use this stuff, and of course we know the damage that it does to the individual, we know the damage that it does to their families, we know the damage that it actually does to the broader society. So there's very, very real personal cost around, you know, these illicit markets and the way they work. I've spoken about the danger of corruption of public institutions, and that is a real danger that organised crime poses. But also, if left unchecked, it poses a real threat to legitimate business. So, for instance, here in Victoria, you know, the Minister mentioned we hope you can hang around for the Spring Racing Carnival. It's a great time of year in Victoria. You know, the races return enormous economic benefit to the state, great social benefit. You know, the ladies love to dress up, go to the races, have a great day, spend lots of money. It's fantastic. But if left unchecked, that's the very sort of area that organised crime will go. And again, we'd started to see some signs of that back in the early 2000s where, you know, organised crime figures were being seen at the races. They're starting to have interest in race courses and, of course, racehorses. And, of course, if they have an interest in racehorses, they want to bet and win. So what do you think they're then doing? They're then trying to use bookmakers and others to either launder money or to actually, you know, subvert and start to use that as a way of making money. So tourism can also be affected. I mean, I think at the height of the gangland wars here in Victoria, Victoria internationally was starting to attract a reputation for itself as being an unsafe place to be. Now, that's utter nonsense. We are a very safe and stable community, but the public perception was starting to shift in terms of why would you go there? The place is awash with organised crooks who just settle their disputes with gunfights on the streets. And so it starts to have an impact on things like tourism. It starts to actually have an impact into the real economy, where businesses are saying, no, maybe we don't want to go to Melbourne. Maybe we'll go to Sydney. Of course, the irony is you're much safer here in Melbourne than you are in Sydney. Had to get that in.